General Marcus Thorne's arrival was timely, leaving Capital City no opportunity to dispatch a new commander. The name Thunder of Fort Redemption carried immense weight. He was the legendary Silver Spear of the Snow Pass, a senior to Caleb, General Russo, and Colonel Grant. He had been away from the active military for years, commanded no personal forces, and came from humble origins as the adopted son of Director Evans, the former head of the Federal Security Service during the previous administration. With no powerful family to interfere, his willingness to lead was a godsend for Secretary of State Hayes. While Thorne waited to be summoned by President Thompson, he stood with Leo under a glass portico, watching the rain. He explained that the journey had been rushed, leaving no time for elaborate messages. Thorne's coat was half-soaked. He had only stopped to switch vehicles, not to rest. He softened his tone, informing Leo that Caleb had been evacuated to a field hospital and was receiving medical attention, urging him not to worry. But Thorne omitted the details of Caleb's injuries. Leo, head slightly bowed, remained silent for a long moment before asking about the nature of the wounds. Thorne gazed into the rain-swept night, stating that some things could only be discussed right there, under the open sky. Caleb's rations had been tampered with, and even Lieutenant Riley had fallen ill. An entire unit went into battle weakened, only to encounter the Vulture's most hardened insurgents. Caleb had sustained 3 separate blade wounds. It was Riley, after being knocked from his vehicle, who rallied a dozen remaining soldiers to carry him out of the encirclement. Leo's hands clenched into fists at his sides. Thorne's eyes were dark pools in the dim light as he spoke with grim composure. He reminded Leo that Caleb had fought while ill before. He had been at it for so many years that while he appeared resilient, his body was a tapestry of old injuries. This time, his core strength had been compromised. A 6-month leave, Thorne suggested, would serve as a necessary period of recuperation. But it was cold comfort. Thorne had mentored both brothers. He knew their temperaments intimately. Caleb was gentle on the surface but possessed an iron will. He hadn't inherited his father's near-superhuman physique or his unbending, absolute authority. Everything Caleb lacked, Leo possessed in abundance. With another man, this might have bred resentment, but Caleb cherished his family. He had his mother's compassion, a core part of his nature that precluded any thought of harming his younger brother. He saw himself as their shield, healing his own wounds in silence. He never once complained of pain. Colonel Grant had often said that Caleb, for all his stoicism, was still only human. He retained his humanity while forcing himself to become the stoic guardian of the North Ridge. This defeat had shattered half a lifetime of honor. In that moment, Leo felt an overwhelming hatred for his gilded cage. The shackles he fought against chafed his wounds raw, turning them into a bloody, agonizing mess. His gaze followed the raindrops to the ground, where puddles reflected his silent torment. He forced himself to remain composed, stating with strained calm that the camp's food was prepared by their own staff. His brother ate the same rations as the common soldiers. The saboteurs had harmed him and thousands of others in the camp. He swore that this would not pass, that they would pay with their lives. Thorne informed him that the individuals responsible for the mess hall had already been executed. It was Caleb's order. The North Ridge had suffered a grievous blow, yet the official report cited contaminated military supplies, not deliberate sabotage. Caleb, before collapsing from his injuries, had ordered the executions specifically to prevent an investigation into sabotage. An assassination attempt implied a power struggle, and tearing away the veil of civility would only muddy the waters. The North Ridge was too easily used as a pawn. With Caleb sidelined, The appointment of new leadership would fall into the hands of Capital City. Who could guarantee the poisoners were the true culprits? Assassination by proxy was a classic move. Furthermore, if contaminated food and poison were just the first step, and they reported an assassination attempt that the administration couldn't solve, the political dynasties could twist the narrative, accusing them of fabrication. They could use Caleb's defeat as a pretext to recall Leo. Thorne noted that Leo had also handled himself well, refraining from demanding to return to the North Ridge to rally the troops. If he had spoken impulsively and tried to contest military authority in front of the president, the guilt the administration felt would have morphed into political calculation, putting the president on high alert and creating future liabilities. Leo, struggling to muster his spirits, conceded that he knew Secretary Hayes wouldn't let him go. His mentor was right. Fighting for command would only make the president nervous, especially since he still controlled the 20,000-strong Presidential Guard. It was a line that couldn't be crossed. Besides, causing a scene now would only delay crucial military affairs for the North Ridge. Thorne's arrival, he said, had saved him from a desperate situation. Thorne laid out the immediate plan. He would meet with the president, then coordinate with the Treasury and the cabinet on logistics for the new supply shipments. He had to be on a transport heading back by dawn the next morning at the latest. Their father was engaging the Vulture in the Eastern Range, and they needed to land a decisive blow to crush the insurgents' momentum. Acknowledging this wasn't the place for a detailed briefing, Thorne kept it brief. He admitted it had been a long time since he'd commanded troops, and he would need to get up to speed quickly. The North Ridge forces were different from his old command at Fort Redemption. The North Ridge cavalry excelled at aggressive assaults, whereas he had specialized in defensive sieges. He would need to confer closely with Leo's father on strategy. He added one more thing, informing Leo that Lieutenant Riley was also critically injured. His only remaining family was a sister who had married into a family in Capital City. He instructed Leo to have his aide, Corvo, contact the State Department to ensure she was notified and reassured. Leo nodded his assent. Just as an aide, Mr. Fuller arrived to summon Thorne. Thorne gave Leo one last look, telling him to take care of himself, alone in Capital City. Leo offered a respectful nod, the gesture of a student to his mentor. Thorne turned, pushed through the door, and was gone. Agent Fisher had gotten his wish these past few days, working alongside Director Jiang of the West District Bureau. Tonight, it was a supply issue in the West District that brought Jiang, still acting as its regional director, into the late-night Security Council meeting. He wouldn't be out for hours. Fisher, feeling an old laziness creep in, decided to relax in the office. He sent a junior staffer to fetch him some food. Fisher was leaning back in an ergonomic chair, feet propped up, when the door opened. Bathed in the glow of his desk lamp, he saw Director Vance. Fisher shot to his feet and straightened his tie. Vance, just in from the rain, gestured for him to relax. As Fisher helped Vance with his damp overcoat, Vance asked if the president had started his inquiries yet. Fisher understood the real question. He respectfully reported that General Thorne had arrived. The name gave Vance pause. For a moment he seemed stunned. The old general of the North Ridge was as sharp as ever, giving no one an opening. With Thorne in the picture, no other candidate in Capital City could compare. The North Ridge Cavalry would remain the North Ridge Cavalry. Fisher murmured an agreement but offered no further comment. He knew to keep his distance from such high-level power plays. Vance saw through him and felt a flicker of contempt. Men from unremarkable backgrounds were all the same. No guts, no vision. Their eyes fixed on the petty rewards right in front of them, lacking any real ambition. Despite his thoughts, Vance maintained a pleasant tone as he advised Fisher. He remarked that while this incident was tangentially related to Director Jiang, it wasn't his fault, and no one in the administration would blame him. Sticking with Jiang was a smart move for Fisher's career. Jiang was slated for a transfer to the Central Plains next month, and any future FSS operations there would rely on Fisher's groundwork. He encouraged the younger agent to do well. Fisher quickly affirmed his understanding and escorted Vance toward the door. As he bent to straighten the hem of Vance's trousers, he noticed a smear of dark, grayish residue on the cuff. He instinctively brushed it off, offering a flattering comment about the director having to walk in such weather. "What about it?" Vance's voice was sharp as he snatched his pant leg back. Fisher's words died in his throat. The office was suddenly silent save for the drumming of the downpour outside. The lamplight threw Fisher's face into deep shadow. In the space of a heartbeat, Fisher forced a smile, acting as if nothing had happened. He obsequiously stated that the mud was gone and wished the director a safe trip. Vance stared at him, then slowly released the fabric. He mirrored the smile and after a long moment, simply told him to get back to work. The instant Vance was out the door, Fisher's face went cold. He raised his hand to the light, examining the faint smudge still on his fingertips. It was a mixture of dirt and what looked like wood ash, smeared by the rain, but a tiny fleck of distinctive red clay had not escaped his notice. The Harrison estate had burned down. The Harrisons had used imported red clay for their custom brickwork, a costly and rare material. Not even the wealthiest political families had access to it in the same way. Besides the Harrison estate, nowhere else in Capital City used it. What was Vance doing there at a time like this? Fisher wiped the residue from his finger. The cold sweat on his back was from that single charged glance he had shared with Vance. He stood under the lamp, thoughts racing, but he was certain of one thing. In that one look, Vance had decided he had to die. The next day, General Thorne rode out for the North Ridge. Leo, alongside Secretary Hayes, saw him to the city limits. He couldn't go back himself, but he could dispatch his men. Corvo and Gus would accompany the supply officials from Hayden and Irving counties to oversee the ration shipments. These supplies could not be compromised again. Leo trusted no one from the federal departments. He had already placed an operative, Wallace, in Irving County and had arranged for another ally to transfer a reliable man, Bryson, to Hayden. This way, the entire supply chain to the North Ridge would be under his watch. Leo, having been awake all night, wiped his face with a cold towel. He said that when Bryson returned, he would need to thank him properly. Julian was in the back of the armored SUV. He hadn't slept either, having been on watch. He replied that he had already arranged for Bryson's family to be moved to a secure residence with a protective detail, ensuring he could work without worry. Hayden County was not like Irving. They had no connections there. Forcing them to procure military rations on such short notice would surely breed resentment in the local government. Hayes had chosen them because they had been exempt from the military levy for 8 years and could afford the burden. Leo leaned back against the vehicle's interior wall, the towel still over his face. He paused for a moment. Today they would arrest Senator Graves. He couldn't be allowed to fall into the hands of the Justice Department. They were on friendly terms with Attorney General Pierce, but that relationship couldn't compare to the influence of Secretary Hayes. Leo was done playing games. He had to cut off Graves' escape routes, which meant the case had to bypass the standard interagency review and land squarely with the FSS, in Julian's hands. Julian toyed with the FSS badge on the small console. He considered the name Graves for a moment, then spoke. Since the senator had intercepted the express dispatch, he clearly didn't want the information reaching the president. Yet he had changed his mind at the last minute. There had to be a reason. Leo recalled Graves' behavior in the Security Council meeting the previous night, noting that he had indeed been acting strangely. His usual instinct would have been to deflect all responsibility or find a scapegoat from the Treasury. But last night he hadn't argued at all. He had been cooperative, answering every question. Julian's fingers stopped tapping with a soft click. He pointed out that the harvest in Whitehorse County last year was genuinely bountiful. If the military rations were replaced with substandard goods, where did that massive quantity of grain go? Leo pulled the towel from his face, balling it in his hand. He said flatly that people kill for profit. If that shipment left Whitehorse and traveled the riverways, it could bypass Capital City, reach the Central Plains, and be sold at a premium on the civilian market under a commercial license. Rumors had been circulating since last year that Director Jiang was being transferred to the Central Plains. If someone was using that information to their advantage, the picture became clear. Julian raised his eyes and met Leo's gaze. Someone in the West District Bureau had been colluding with wealthy merchants to sell military supplies. In the past, with Jiang's strict oversight, it had been small-scale pilfering. But this year, Jiang was being transferred. He had been in the capital for his debriefing and was undergoing a standard security review, unable to oversee the supply logistics for the West District. It left a perfect opening. No one expected them to be so audacious as to use contaminated materials as a replacement. Leo's expression was grim. Only a handful of people could handle a shipment of that size. Without your own logistics network, you wouldn't dare touch it. Mr. Harrison. Julian said the name slowly. Mr. Harrison. Leo confirmed it with certainty. His death wasn't their doing. He had become a liability who could implicate others, so he was discarded. During the investigation into the infrastructure collapse, Senator Graves had tried everything to pin the blame on Harrison. It must have been because they were already in business together selling military supplies. Graves was afraid Harrison would crack under scrutiny, so he wanted him dead. Julian considered this. He agreed, recalling that Harrison had indeed said Graves was motivated by money. Harrison had agreed to pay Graves so quickly because he knew the kind of man the senator was and believed him capable of such acts. If that were true, with Harrison dead, Graves had no reason to continue taking such a huge risk. Julian suspected Graves wasn't acting alone this time. He was being leveraged because of his past dealings. When he saw the dispatch, he knew he had been set up and there was no escape. His lack of defense suggested he knew who was pulling the strings. He was trying to take a page from a predecessor's playbook, sacrifice himself to save his family's political dynasty from further damage. Leo listened to the rain, a profound weariness settling over him in the brief lull between political battles. Caleb had done the right thing. The North Ridge's swift execution of the mess staff was a defensive move, preventing them from being used as pawns to eliminate a political rival. No, perhaps it was more than that. Perhaps the goal was indeed to use this military defeat to weaken the North Ridge's power, to dismantle the cavalry that had always been under his family's control and bring it under the thumb of Capital City. Even if they couldn't take the North Ridge immediately, it would create an oversight effect, hamstringing the Sterling family from then on. Julian reached out and took Leo's hand. In the cramped space of the SUV, their eyes met. If General Thorne hadn't arrived last night, he said, Capital City's new military appointment would have been announced this morning. The North Ridge Cavalry would have ceased to be what it was. Leo's hand was cold. After a long moment, he raised his other hand to brush Julian's hair. His voice was raw. The North Ridge Cavalry is the nation's cavalry. His father built it from nothing. It was more important than him or his brother. For so many years, Capital City had failed to understand. They were the nation's shield wall in the north, not traitors in waiting. When the rain stopped, the sky was already dark. A few thin rays of fading light broke through the clouds. The puddles on the pavement were shattered by the passing of polished dress shoes, reflecting a broken sky. It was early summer, yet Capital City felt as if it were still submerged in the rainy season, having not seen a clear sky for days. Secretary Hayes finally had a moment to himself. He sat in a heavy armchair, sipping strong, dark coffee. He was old and his energy was failing. He could feel the exhaustion deep in his bones. But aides were constantly moving about, and documents required his review. He couldn't rest. Attorney General Pierce paused his work. He stood respectfully before Hayes and stated that the Treasury Department had to take responsibility for this supply crisis. He reported that he had already submitted a request to the president for a full interagency review the previous night. The matter couldn't be delayed. He proposed beginning the arrests that very evening. Hayes stirred his coffee, saying nothing for a long time. He gazed out the window, finally remarking that he had been sitting for too long and felt tired. The president was still at dinner. He suggested Pierce join him for a walk. Pierce personally took Hayes's overcoat from a junior aide and helped him put it on. The two men stepped out of the office. It was already dark outside, so Pierce carried a small lantern, following Hayes along the path of a small, manicured garden within the cabinet offices. The night air was a relief. Hayes stated that Pierce's desire to arrest Senator Graves was correct. He added that this situation concerned border security. Pierce could not afford to be lenient with Graves. He simply needed to follow the law. Pierce, guessing Hayes had more to say, lit the path for him. He had already switched to a more personal tone, addressing him as his mentor. He agreed with the assessment. Graves had been so audacious this time that even his powerful patrons couldn't protect him. Pierce had noticed the senator's increasingly reckless behavior this year. It was past time someone sent him a message. Military affairs were not like other political matters. This could not be tolerated. The general of the North Ridge returning to active command was a shot to Capital City. Hayes stopped. The sky was now completely dark. He stood in silence for a moment, then spoke again. General Sterling is a wolf. During the long years of political struggle with the powerful families, he remained on the sidelines, feigning illness. He watched Caleb exhaust himself, watched Leo become a hostage in the capital. He put both his sons in danger. Pierce had to ask himself why. Infected by Hayes's tone, Pierce's mood turned somber. He answered to make concessions. The general was making concessions with his sons as the price. The established families were a fortress in Capital City. He had broken their rules from the frontier. He might have had opportunities to press his advantage, but he had stepped back. He retreated, but the Madam Chairwoman hadn't understood. Hayes felt a deep, soul-crushing fatigue. She hadn't understood, Graves hadn't understood, and none of the great families had understood. When General Sterling broke the rules, his retreat wasn't out of fear. It was a gesture of loyalty to the nation, to the bond between ruler and subject. But everything pushed to an extreme snaps back. Their relentless pressure was like urging the general to turn around and bare his fangs. Power struggles have always been inevitable, but when they spill over into matters of war, it is an omen of a nation's collapse. The Central Plains debacle years ago, he recalled, the government was rife with corruption. They had made a mess of public affairs. When his generation took over, they faced crises both at home and abroad. Hayes coughed in the wind, waving away Pierce's attempt to support him. The treasury was only just this year solvent enough to fund disaster relief. The West District had done well, solving the supply problems for two major commands. The North Ridge was stable, the border was stable. A capable administrator like Jiang was about to be sent to the Central Plains, offering hope for its revitalization. The universities were flourishing, the number of independent public servants was growing. The new head of the Inspector General's office was competent, and there were promising young talents rising through the ranks. Even the president was no longer consumed by frivolity. Hayes's voice filled with sorrow. He had thought the dawn was breaking for the nation, but now he felt increasingly powerless. Pierce was alarmed, rushing to support him, his eyes reddening. He asked why his mentor was speaking in such a defeatist way. The general was not that kind of man. This time, with him overseeing the investigation, the North Ridge would not be wronged. There was still a chance to turn things around. But Hayes was not reassured. How much longer could his frail body support the nation? He was one man trying to shore up a collapsing dam. He was different from the others. He could neither act with the unchecked impunity of the great families, nor could he fully align himself with the North Ridge. He was the Secretary of State. His duty was to President Thompson. He had to make a choice that maintained the balance, even if that choice led to his own violent end. He had to make it. The North Ridge's fury was ignited. General Sterling was leading his forces in the Eastern Range. When the fighting subsided, he would undoubtedly turn back to settle accounts with Capital City. When that time came, Hayes said no matter what the general did, they could not release Leo. Not even if the North Ridge offered Caleb's wife and son in exchange. The general put his sons in danger to temper them, all for this day. Caleb was grievously wounded. Now was the time for him to sheath his sword. Leo was a young prodigy. 6 years of being hammered and forged in Capital City had sharpened his edge. To let him go back now would be to release a tiger into the mountains. Hayes's voice was heavy with the weight of his years. He told Pierce he couldn't hold on for much longer. They had to treat the North Ridge well, but they could never loosen the leash. He knew that after he was gone, the world would be full of people calling him a fool. But he asked Pierce, who would dare tell him that the North Ridge would never rebel? That the Eastern Command would never rebel? Even if today's General Sterling could endure it, could a future Commander Leo truly endure it? The nation couldn't afford to take that gamble. He declared that whatever the North Ridge was owed, he would personally ensure they received every bit of it. Senator Graves had dared to sell military supplies. Pierce was to execute him according to the law. If anyone pleaded for him, Hayes would personally submit an impeachment. Pierce acknowledged the order. Hayes paused, gathering his strength. He announced he was sending a letter to General Sterling, abolishing the position of military overseer. The administration would not send any political commissars to meddle this time. All military affairs, large and small, would remain under the general's sole command. Pierce hesitated, pointing out that abolishing the overseer position was something the Madam Chairwoman would likely not approve. Hayes retorted, asking if the nation didn't have a president. It was a century-old tradition that the executive's inner circle could not interfere in governance. This time, she would have no say. Besides, war was not an essay contest. What was the use of sending a few sycophants to the front lines? It was just a waste of resources. He continued, noting that these political aides were the leader's inner circle, a kind of shadow cabinet. They lived sheltered lives, ignorant of the people's suffering and the principles of governance. The last chief of staff, he reminded Pierce, was an educated man, but all he did was frame loyal officials and harm the country. A wise man doesn't stand in the shadow of a crumbling wall. They had just purged one corrupt faction. They couldn't give another a foothold. He would have an aide draft the executive order immediately and submit it to the president that night. Just then, Mr. Fuller appeared with a lantern. He kept his distance, bowing slightly and announcing in a respectful tone that the secretary and the attorney general were requested back in the council room. Hayes grunted an acknowledgement, his displeasure evident. Pierce supported the old man as they walked back. Feeling Hayes's frame, he realized just how gaunt the secretary had become. A wave of sorrow washed over him, but he hid it in the darkness. Leo, having changed into a fresh uniform, re-entered the briefing room. Special Prosecutor Reed was also present, seated at the far end of the table. Reed argued that the ration case was of great importance, involving collusion between officials and merchants, which reflected poorly on local government. If not handled swiftly and severely, it could encourage others to disregard the law. The Inspector General, having just returned from a smoke break, spoke with forced patience. He addressed the president directly, requesting to begin the investigation that night, starting with the arrest of Senator Graves. He also proposed securing the Graves family's financial records and properties to prevent them from transferring assets. President Thompson had been in meetings for a day and a night. He was so tired he could barely keep his eyes open. He managed a nod, mumbling that the military supplies were a serious matter. What to do with Graves, whether to execute him or seize his assets, was for the cabinet to decide. Another official noted the case's broad scope, pointing out that even Director Jiang would have to be suspended pending investigation. The Graves family was large and powerful. The Justice Department alone could take months to complete the investigation. Leo's thumb gently rubbed the heavy ring on his other thumb, turning it slowly. He interjected, mentioning that the interagency review of the epidemic case was still unresolved. The Inspector General's office was already stretched thin, having to audit accounts across the country to prevent similar cases of corruption. He observed that everyone seemed to be facing difficulties with limited manpower. Reed smoothly picked up the thread. He agreed that resources were tight, but stated that some matters take precedence. The North Ridge was at war. The ration issue was top priority. The Justice Department and the Inspector General's office would naturally have to focus on it. It was no trouble at all. President Thompson, not the sharpest tool in the shed, sensed Leo was hinting at something, but Reed's interruption left him confused. He fidgeted, looked toward Secretary Hayes, and asked for his opinion. Hayes looked at no one. After a pause, he asked Leo directly if he was worried the interagency review would take too long. Leo confirmed this. The process was too complex, and a man like Graves, who had been in high office for years, was cunning. He was concerned that delays would lead to unforeseen complications. President Thompson quickly agreed. He added that the Graves family had always been close to the Madam Chairwoman. If the case dragged on, he was worried she would become distressed and it would affect her health. But without the interagency review, Pierce countered, they couldn't thoroughly investigate the network of corruption below Graves. These people had been emboldened by his protection. Leaving them in place would be a future disaster. Leo clarified that he was only concerned about the timeline, not about avoiding a full investigation. He looked at the president, posing a question. Was that process the only option available in Capital City? An idea sparked in Thompson's mind. He slapped his thigh. For a rapid investigation, they should use the FSS. The last case involving Mr. Harrison and a ring of mercenaries had been handled very quickly by that agent, Julian. He proposed putting Julian in charge of this case. Reed interjected that a case of this magnitude was too much for a deputy director. Julian's rank was a limitation. Director Vance would be a more suitable choice. Leo shifted his gaze to Reed's face and offered a faint smile. He agreed that Julian was indeed unsuitable to lead the case. He was young, inexperienced, and they had a history of animosity. He wouldn't feel comfortable with him in charge. This reverse psychology worked on Hayes. He knew Vance also had ties to Leo and worried Leo might use the connection to push the investigation too far. It was better to give it to Julian, who was known to be at odds with Leo. The two would be at each other's throats, providing mutual oversight, preventing either from manipulating the outcome. Hayes dismissed Leo's objection as prejudice. Julian was young and inexperienced, but he had been promoted on merit and had successfully handled several difficult cases. Giving him more experience was a good thing. Hayes turned to the president. The case would be led by the FSS, making it a federal security matter. Julian happened to be the head of the Northern Division, so it fit his job description. However, he cautioned against rushing things. While they were bypassing the formal interagency review, oversight from all three departments was still necessary. He asked for the president's opinion. Thompson knew Hayes was making a concession. Not wanting to appear overly biased toward Leo, he immediately agreed. He would issue the directive for Julian to begin the investigation that very night. After 2 consecutive days of meetings, the council finally adjourned. Everyone was to go home and rest. As they left, President Thompson had a sedan brought to take the elderly Hayes to the main gate. Pierce and the others walked out together. Leo nodded to them and went his own way. Pierce watched Leo's retreating back inside, remarking that Leo seemed hurt and no longer trusted the Justice Department, preferring to work with Vance. The Inspector General, descending the steps, scoffed at the idea. He questioned Vance's character, asserting that Secretary Hayes had made the right choice in selecting Julian. He then asked Reed if he was heading straight home. Reed, following behind, smiled and confirmed he was. After several nights sleeping in his office, it was time to go home and get organized. There were more cases to attend to in the coming days. The Inspector General was fond of mentoring junior officials and had brought several promising agents up through the ranks. He had also taken an interest in Julian. He held a similar appreciation for Reed's talent and offered a few words of encouragement. The 3 men went their separate ways at the main gate, each getting into their own vehicle. Late that night, a knock on the door woke Reed's household manager. He threw on a robe and went to see who it was. The sight of grim-faced FSS agents, armed and in tactical gear, made him freeze. Before he could ask any questions, the agent in the lead, a man named Jones, casually pushed past him. Jones inquired if they had eaten. Seeing as it was still early, he presumed they hadn't. He instructed the manager to inform the kitchen to prepare food for the FSS agents as well, and while he was at it, to wake everyone in the house. They were there to conduct a search. The manager, holding a lamp, tried to block their path, protesting that this was outrageous. Julian stood in the doorway, his gaze menacing. He stated that they didn't need to show a warrant yet. Anyone obstructing a federal investigation would be taken into custody. He told the man to inform Reed that he was looking for him. FSS agents flooded into the residence, moving swiftly through the corridors. The household was roused from sleep. The women of the family, terrified, huddled together as they were herded out of their rooms and into the main courtyard. The FSS had a fearsome reputation. In their eyes, Julian was a predator. Reed's older brother, Evan, hastily dressed and came out to find Reed already standing under the eaves. He lunged at his younger brother, grabbing him and demanding to know what he had done to bring the FSS to their door. He threatened to disown him, to strip him of the family name if he brought them all down. Reed looked at his brother's contorted, furious face and allowed himself to be shaken. His expression was a mixture of pity and cold detachment. He remarked that the family shares in the glory, but one person bears the blame when disaster strikes. He told his brother not to be afraid. He wasn't the head of the family yet. With that, he pushed Evan away and walked down the steps toward Julian. This was their second face-to-face meeting. Reed had not been asleep. He was in his study working on a case. He emerged wearing a simple, wide-sleeved robe. The man possessed an unshakable poise, a refined air that was clearly genuine, not an affectation. He had real ability. Julian had never denied that. Reed stopped a few feet from Julian. He was about the same height. He acknowledged the late-night visit from the deputy director, remarking with dry politeness that he should have prepared refreshments and welcomed him earlier. Julian studied the calligraphy on a scroll in the main hall, not looking at Reed. He spoke casually, stating that he had just received a presidential directive to lead the military ration investigation. It was a serious matter, and the FSS had acted immediately by arresting Senator Graves. He explained that since Graves was known to be an associate of Reed's, they had to search his residence to avoid any appearance of impropriety. Reed glanced around the chaotic courtyard. He acknowledged that he was aware of the details of the investigation, as his office was assisting the FSS. However, he reminded Julian that he was a government official. To search his home, the FSS needed a warrant issued by the Justice Department. But, he conceded, the case was urgent, and the deputy director had the authority to act first and justify later. He then instructed his manager to give the FSS agents the keys to the inner quarters and to guide them wherever they wished to search. Julian turned his head slightly. He said that Reed was truly capable, even prepared for an impromptu presidential order. Reed smiled. When dealing with someone like the deputy director, he replied, caution was only prudent. He suggested that since it was cold outside and the search would likely take until morning, Julian might come inside for a cup of coffee. Julian slowly turned to face him fully. He declined the offer, stating that he couldn't afford the hospitality of the powerful. He then asked if this meant his trip tonight would be fruitless. Reed replied that it depended on what the deputy director had come for. If it was for the investigation, then yes, it would be a disappointment. His association with Graves was purely professional. There was no conspiracy. Julian fell silent, his eyes fixed on Reed. That familiar, frustrating feeling of being played with began to surface again. After a long moment, Agent Jones returned to the courtyard and gave Julian a subtle shake of his head from a distance. Julian knew then that he had come up empty. His mentor wasn't here. A man of many resources, Julian murmured softly. Merely a fish at the bottom of the barrel, gasping for a final breath. Reed responded with practiced humility. Julian began to walk toward him. He told Reed this was their one and only chance. He demanded to know where the man was. There was no moon, and the post-rain chill was pervasive. The men and women in the courtyard were weeping quietly. Evan, ignorant of the full situation and terrified that Reed would further provoke Julian, rushed forward. He bowed deeply to Julian, stammering anxiously and asking who the director was looking for. He swore they were not harboring any fugitives from the ration case. Everyone in the household was present, he insisted, ready to be questioned. Reed remained silent. Seeing he wouldn't reveal his mentor's location, Julian spoke again. He was looking for a fugitive wanted by the state. He had heard that Reed kept a number of young protégés in his residence. Was that true? Reed's expression flickered. Evan immediately jumped in. Yes, he confirmed there were. But he explained that these were just trivial dalliances, kept secret from the Inspector General's prying eyes. He begged Julian to see that they were just harmless young people, not wanted criminals. Julian saw the subtle change in Reed's expression as his brother spoke. He turned his gaze to the group of terrified young men and women. He asked what the Orchid Pavilion was. It was a place, he stated, connected to an assassination plot, filled with wanted criminals. He accused Reed of quietly acquiring people from there without notifying the Justice Department. Reed pushed his brother aside. He insisted that these individuals all had proper documentation. Though they came from a troubled background, they were innocent. The deputy director was here tonight for the ration case, which had nothing to do with them. He questioned why Julian was harassing them. Julian looked back at him. Their innocence would be determined after a visit to FSS headquarters. He gave the order to take them all away. The group erupted in cries of despair. Jones was the first to grab someone. The young men, who Reed had educated to be like scholars, were no match for the seasoned agents. The crying intensified. Evan was shaking so badly he could barely stand. He tried to mediate, even bringing up Leo's name. He stammered that since the case involved the North Ridge, perhaps they should consult with Commander Sterling. If there was a real problem, he pleaded, Julian could take Reed himself. Reed lunged forward, blocking Jones's path. He shouted that the FSS still had to follow procedure. He told Julian he could take his people, but he demanded to see an arrest warrant from the Justice Department. Take them away, Julian commanded again. He drew his sidearm, its presence forcing Reed to step back. He told Reed he wanted a warrant. By morning, he could have as many as he wanted. Reed, the prosecutor's composure finally broke. He flung back his sleeve. You're acting on a personal vendetta. I'll have you impeached. Then file your complaint tonight. Julian's voice turned to ice. These people are in my hands now. For every day I don't see my teacher, I'll kill one of them. How long do you think it will take me to get to your prize student? You wouldn't dare. Reed was shaking with rage. As he saw Jones dragging his students away amidst their terrified screams, he grabbed Jones's arm. You're acting like tyrants, arresting innocent people. What kind of investigation is this? Stop. If you interfere again, I will use force right now. Julian's thumb flicked the safety off his weapon. Evan, seeing the escalating confrontation and Julian's readiness to shoot, was overcome with terror and fainted on the spot. Servants rushed to his side. Reed was restrained by FSS agents, forced to watch as his students were loaded into transport vehicles. Julian. Reed struggled against his captors, all composure gone, his eyes bloodshot. He shouted with hatred, You dare kill him? You dare? You violent brute. You're not worthy of being his student. Julian mounted his horse, leaving Reed's furious shouts behind him. The war drums were beating for the North Ridge, and the border was far from quiet. Colonel Grant returned to camp, exhausted. Before he could even dismount, his second-in-command hurried over, asking what was wrong. The deputy's face was grim. He reported in a low voice that the government overseer from Capital City had arrived, along with this year's supply shipment. Grant was silent for a moment. He dismounted, removed his helmet, and pushed aside the flap of his command tent. A man in an expensive, garish suit and a fashionable hat was seated in the place of honor. He saw Grant enter but made no move to stand. Grant set his rifle aside and asked why the gentleman wasn't resting after his long journey. He said he had ordered a tent prepared for him. The bureaucrat, a recently promoted functionary named Finch, had connections in the administration. He knew his superiors held the Grant family in low regard, so he treated the colonel with disdain. He sneered, remarking on the barren and poor state of the region, filled with clumsy fools who knew nothing of proper service. He told the colonel not to bother. He had already seen the tent, and it was dark and filthy, completely unsuitable. He had already sent an urgent dispatch to the nearest city to procure lumber. He planned to build a proper villa here. He would be staying for 6 months, after all. Grant was a man of few words. He knew these government overseers were always a delicate, demanding sort and didn't bother to argue. As he undid the straps of his body armor, blood and grime dripped onto the floor. Finch recoiled, covering his nose in disgust, exclaiming at the foul state of it. The deputy brought over a medical kit to dress Grant's wounds. Seeing the raw flesh, he too exclaimed that the colonel's skin was completely worn away and that they needed to get a medic. Grant motioned for him to be quiet. He took out a combat knife from his boot, poured alcohol over the wound, and heated the blade in a candle flame. The deputy quickly held his sleeve out of the way. Finch, who had never witnessed such a raw display, felt a chill run down his spine at the sound of the colonel carving away the dead flesh. Grant applied a powder and had his deputy bandage the wound. He explained that cavalry skirmishes were difficult. Without direct orders, they couldn't pursue beyond their designated patrol area. The constant friction of combat meant there was no time to tend to such things. After finishing, Grant leaned on his knees and looked at Finch, asking if he had brought the military rations. Finch, fighting back nausea, nodded. Grant stood up. "I'll go take a look." He and his deputy left the tent and headed for the supply depot. The transport crew had already departed. Grant entered the storage container, untied a sack, and frowned at what he saw inside. He grabbed a handful. It was all damp, moldy flour. His deputy said that not only were the supplies spoiled, but the quantity was also short. Their border command had 20,000 soldiers. They were on constant patrol, covering vast distances, burning more calories than the garrison troops in the other 4 sectors. This amount of food wouldn't even last them until autumn. Grant's scarred hand let the foul grains fall. He said that Secretary Hayes had always looked out for them, and last year's funding had come through quickly. There had to be a reason for the shortage this time. The deputy's chest heaved. He started to speak several times, but held it back. Grant told him to speak his mind, asking who was stopping him. The deputy, overcome with indignation, grabbed a handful of the moldy rations. Emotion welled up, his voice cracking. Why was it short? Because it was urgently diverted to the North Ridge Cavalry. Damn it all. The North Ridge were heroes and the Border Command were second-class soldiers. They always favored them, always treated him with contempt. But this was war. They were all risking their lives, so why the preferential treatment? What was wrong with the Border Command? They were poor as dirt, and still they cut their supplies from all sides. He had asked the transport crew what they were supposed to do in the fall. They said the administration told them to figure it out themselves. Figure it out. To hell with them and their figure it out. The deputy clenched his fist. The Eastern Command's rations were cut in half to supply the North Ridge, but the other sectors weren't even in active combat. They had military farms to sustain them. All the Border Command could do was eat sand. Once autumn arrived, the nomad tribe's horses would be strong, and the fighting would get even harder. With these supplies, they were... That's enough, Grant cut him off. He stood in the dim light for a long time, then looked out at the starry sky. His voice was hoarse. I'll find a way. The signal towers of the Border Command were silent sentinels in the rolling hills. The night was like an ink spill, blocking out the light from the heavens. Grant lacked the fame of the other 3 commanders. He was like a stubborn rock on the edge of the desert, bearing the pressure from 3 sides. His once smooth exterior had been ground down into sharp, awkward angles. His family had lost many members. He was the last one to carry his father's rifle. He was slow-witted and not well-liked. He had come into his own late in life, lacking the natural talent of Caleb or General Russo. He was his father's clumsiest son. Yet it was he who had held the border after his father's retirement, firmly gripping the throat of the nomad cavalry's advance. He had no mentor. He was a general forged in the sand at his father's side. He was honest and sincere. He was covered in scars. That night, Grant didn't sleep. He sat on a dusty rise in front of the camp, holding his rifle, unable to think of a solution to the supply crisis. General Russo commanded 5 sectors. Over the years, she had emptied her personal accounts to help them. He couldn't keep asking her for help. His own father was ill at home. He couldn't ask him to drag his sick body around, begging for loans. When his deputy got up in the middle of the night, he saw Grant's lonely figure and wanted to tell him to rest. But as he approached, he saw Grant bend down and press his hand to the earth beneath his feet. He stayed that way for a long, long time. Senator Graves was imprisoned, and the West District's Deputy Director Shaw was also in FSS custody. It was the biggest case of the year, and all of Capital City was watching. Julian moved quickly. Following Shaw's confession, he discovered that Graves had been selling military supplies since 4 years into the previous administration. Using his position as head of the Treasury, Graves would purchase military-grade supplies from Shaw during every procurement cycle and then sell them at a high price to Mr. Harrison. Harrison would then distribute these supplies through land and sea routes to the Central Plains and overseas markets, making a huge profit while shifting the tax burden onto the citizens of the 13 cities of the West District. Julian reviewed Shaw's confession. He asked why, after so many years, he had suddenly developed a conscience and decided to report Graves. Shaw, having spent several days in an FSS black site, hung his head. This time, he said, it was contaminated material different from before. The North Ridge was at war. Sending those supplies would be poison to the soldiers on the front lines. He was afraid something would happen to the general's son. There was no one else at the interrogation table. Leo sat in the shadows, his voice cutting through the quiet. And you were so sure these rations would end up on the commander's plate? Shaw shifted uncomfortably, his lips pale. He insisted he was just afraid. He was greedy, but he didn't want to be a murderer. Julian glanced at Leo, then softened his tone toward Shaw. He told him not to be afraid. Though this was a secure facility, the case was being personally overseen by the president. Anything he said here would be heard. The contrast between the 2 men was stark. Shaw swallowed hard, disoriented by the round-the-clock questioning. He mumbled that he didn't know. Julian gently prompted him, asking what he didn't know. Shaw's voice broke. He didn't know the commander's son would really be in danger. He didn't know. He was worried the North Ridge cavalry would be defeated, allowing the insurgents to break through again. Leo leaned forward, his large frame casting a shadow over Shaw. His voice was cold. So you knew this shipment could lead to the defeat of the North Ridge cavalry. And yet you still packed them onto the trucks. You deserve to die. Shaw flinched under Leo's gaze, his throat tight. He cried, incoherent, that he confessed he deserved to die. You won't die, Julian said, his handsome face deceptively kind, his upturned eyes full of compassion. The main culprit in this case is Senator Graves. He used his position to coerce you. You had no choice. I understand your predicament, and so does the commander. Shaw, you entered public service years ago. You spent half your life as an official in the West District, rising to a senior position. You were recognized by the Inspector General's office as a capable civil servant. Now that Director Jiang has left, the top position in the West District is vacant. Based on age and experience, the Office of Personnel would have recommended you first. You see, you had a bright future ahead of you. To throw it all away for a little money, it's not worth it. Shaw sobbed, his body hunched over. Julian continued, his voice full of pity. I hear you were born in Whitehorse County, to a poor family. Your father died when you were 6, and your mother raised you and your siblings alone. She sent you all to school, enduring hardship for most of her life. She finally saw you become a successful official, and now you've made such a terrible mistake. From now on, she'll be left all alone, and she'll have to endure the scorn of others because of this case. How could you be so cruel? Shaw broke down completely. He was an educated man with a sense of honor and shame. At home, he was known for his filial piety. He covered his face with his hands and wept. I've committed a crime worse than any animal. I have no face to see my mother again. The case isn't closed yet, Leo said, tossing the confession file aside. Whether you'll be executed is still under discussion. Since you still know shame, you haven't completely lost your conscience. The questions I'm about to ask you won't be recorded in the official transcript. If you answer truthfully, I'll do everything I can to save your life and ensure your mother can live out her old age in peace. But if you dare to be evasive, I'll have you beheaded in the public square immediately. Your one dispatch took down graves and smashed the golden rice bowl of many powerful people. You were part of this business. You know better than anyone what happens to the families of those who talk. Without my personal guarantee, the lives of your entire family are in danger. Shaw cried for a long time. When he finally stopped, Julian personally handed him a cup of hot water. He hastily wiped his tears, thanking them repeatedly. He held the cup in both hands, silent for a long moment, before speaking. The commander's willingness to protect me is a debt I can never repay. I dare not hope for a future in public service. I only ask for exile. This case is far-reaching. It's not something that can be explained in a moment. I will tell you everything slowly. He began. Since the start of the previous administration, the National Treasury has been severely depleted. The Treasury's books were a mess. The former Chief of Staff, in league with the previous administration's power brokers, approved many wasteful public works projects. Most were never intended for completion. They were just pretexts to get projects approved by the cabinet and siphon money from the Treasury. This was an open secret. With collusion between officials and merchants, money flowed like water into their pockets. It was Senator Graves who brought him into the scheme. He swore it was the truth. He knew he shouldn't touch the money, but he had no choice. When regional officials came to the capital, they were expected to pay ice tributes to the two ruling factions. The phrase pay for promotion was common back then. The great families had their own sources of income. It was the officials from humble backgrounds like him who were hurt by these bribes. No money, no access to the inner circle, no assignments. That year, the West District suffered a locust plague. The 13 cities had no harvest. It was Director Jiang who took full responsibility, protecting them and forcing open commercial warehouses to distribute relief grain to the people, preventing a famine. For this, Jiang became a thorn in the side of the wealthy merchants of the West District. It was known even in capital city that debt collectors were showing up at his house. His elderly mother had to weave cloth to pay off his debts. But everyone knew what debts he was really paying. He was paying the nation's debts. But there was one thing others didn't know, which the West District Bureau knew best. The timing of the Central Plains military defeat was too perfect. At that time, the National Treasury was empty. The West District was in crisis, and the North Ridge and border commands were dealing with insurgents. The harvest in the river provinces was also poor. People were already starving to death across the country at the start of the year. The Treasury was under immense pressure, but they couldn't provide relief because the Treasury was empty. The Chief of Staff had to give an answer to the country. Secretary Hayes was investigating the accounts. The Chief of Staff was trapped. He was scrambling to deal with it. At the time, his family was selling off properties, and the Harrison family bought them. Everyone knew he was trying to refill the treasury to cover things up. But the deficit was too large for one person to fill. So he started calling in debts from others. I don't know if he ever got the money back, but at that critical juncture, insurgents launched a surprise attack at the river crossing. The local garrison was crushed, and the commanding general retreated, leading to a catastrophic defeat for the Central Plains. The North Ridge Cavalry and the Eastern Command provided reinforcements on two fronts, stopping the insurgents from advancing on Capital City. But though the territory was reclaimed, the cities that had been massacred were empty. The relief grain that was later sent to the West District was originally meant for the Central Plains. Julian suddenly stood up. He stood in the dim light, speechless. A cold dread filled Leo. He and Julian had considered many possibilities, but they had never imagined that the Central Plains defeat could have been a way to replenish the empty coffers in the capital. To pay the debts of the Chief of Staff and the other officials caught in the financial investigation. That was over 100,000 lives, Julian said, his voice hollow. He braced himself on the table, staring into the darkness. That was 40,000 soldiers' lives. Do you know what you're saying? The words hit him like a physical blow. For 6 years, he had convinced himself those people had died in a power struggle. Those vibrant lives, those young men, they had existed. Their city was the first line of defense. They had died so horribly. The songs echoing in the canyons of that battlefield were Julian's lifelong nightmare. The Central Plains defeat had countless victims. The fallen soldiers were left unburied, and their blood stained the dreams of the survivors. In the oppressive atmosphere, Shaw held his head in his hands. This time, with the contaminated supplies, I was truly scared. The Central Plains still had a chance of being rescued, but the North Ridge only has the border pass as support. If the insurgents break through the North Ridge, I will be a traitor for all time. The insurgents' arrival in the Central Plains was too coincidental. Their southern advance wasn't random. They had received intelligence. Leo's blood ran cold. Then the encounter between the insurgents and Caleb in the Eastern Range was also no accident. Capital City, the Central Plains, the North Ridge, even the Eastern Command, there were people everywhere passing information to the insurgents. They were keeping them fed, like a starving wolf on a leash, ready to be released to devour any inconvenient evidence. Shaw said in a terrified voice that he didn't know if anyone in the central government was still doing such things. But this time was too close. The Treasury now had reserves, and the cabinet was strictly auditing the books. To let the insurgents in again would be treason. He didn't know, he didn't dare to gamble. His personal communications were monitored. He could only use the official dispatch to warn Capital City. Julian suddenly grabbed Shaw. If you wanted to report Graves, why did you use a Treasury Department letterhead for an urgent dispatch? That dispatch would go straight to Graves' desk the moment it arrived in the capital. Shaw fumbled with his water cup, and it shattered on the floor. No. I clearly used a Justice Department letterhead. Julian froze. Shaw's face was a mask of fear and disbelief. If that dispatch fell into Graves' hands, I would be a dead man. I know Attorney General Pierce is a man of courage, not from one of the great families. He would never cover for Graves. I checked it again and again before sending it. It was addressed to the Justice Department. It was a setup, Leo said, grabbing Julian's arm to steady him, his eyes fierce. Graves didn't do it this time. When Graves received the dispatch, he knew someone else had already seen its contents. It was a silent threat. He had to turn himself in. Senator Graves, now in his late 50s, was stripped of his tailored suit and dressed in a plain white prison jumpsuit. He wore shackles separated from Leo by iron bars. He hadn't been mistreated during his interrogation. His hair was neat, his face clean, but in just a few days he seemed to have aged years, looking utterly haggard. He sat on a stool, speaking to both of them. The interrogation ended last night. My confession has been submitted. Now I'm just waiting for the sentence. Do you have any more questions? Misappropriating public funds, selling military supplies, poisoning a commander on the front lines. All three were capital offenses. Leo studied him. Your brother has also been removed from office and is awaiting censure. Your family's main line has lost 2 high-ranking officials in one blow. How can you be so willing to let it happen this time? Who would dare show favoritism when the North Ridge is involved? Graves replied, No one is protecting me. Your father has returned to command. The president has probably been losing sleep for days. The general is as tough as ever. He knows how to send a message. But you knew those contaminated rations were headed for the North Ridge when you approved them, Leo countered. You did it anyway. You weren't worried about protection then. He took a step closer. Getting that poison to my brother's plate was a multi-step process. First, the substitution. Second, when the supplies reached the North Ridge, you bribed the inspectors to look the other way. Third, you bribed the cavalry's own kitchen staff to mix the poison into the food. He paused, his gaze fixed on Graves. These arrangements were time-consuming and risky. If exposed, you would be implicated, and the Justice Department would launch a full investigation that would uncover your past crimes. That's not your style. Graves didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past Leo to Julian, who had been sitting quietly behind him. He chuckled. The young commander has learned a lot in his 6 years in Capital City. When he first arrived, he was all rage and fury. Deputy Director, you know this well. That's why I say General Sterling has an iron fist, daring to sharpen his son on a blade. You should thank your father for the man you've become. Leo watched him, his expression cold. It was Julian who spoke, pushing aside the files and steepling his fingers on the table. His face was neutral, neither angry nor smiling. He calmly addressed Graves. Yes, seeing Leo like this must be unsettling for you. Your own son spent his youth in nightclubs and bars. Now, with the new administration, his path to a political career through the usual channels is blocked. You're getting old. There's no one in your family's direct line capable of carrying the torch. You pinned your hopes on a political marriage, but even they knew your family was in decline. The prize went to another dynasty. You've spent your time as Treasury Secretary sabotaging newcomers, afraid of being replaced. Your family may still appear to be at its peak, but in reality, the water is about to overflow the dam. When you die, your family is destined to fall. Graves stroked his shackles. Family fortunes are like the tides. They rise and fall. That's the way of the world. It was my family's time. I have no regrets. The nation has endured for generations. Everything changes except for the great families. So my death is my family's survival. Do the great families really never change? Leo asked. The Harrison brothers turned on each other, and their line has died out. There are no heirs. The Harrison family of the future will not be the same. Their exclusion from the halls of power is only a matter of time. Graves just smiled. As long as the Harrison name exists, they will not be out of the game. You killed the last heir today, hoping to carve up their assets, but you can't abandon their businesses, so you still need people to manage them. Is the Harrison family truly dead? They've only lost a leader. It's a temporary setback. In the future, the widow will find a new partner. As long as she wants to control the family's businesses, her new partner will have to marry in and change his name. The children will still be named Harrison. That is the new continuation of the family line. The candle wax dripped down, and the night was almost over. Outside, it was silent. Graves stood up, like an elder guiding a philosophical discussion. I have a question I've always wanted to ask General Sterling personally. But now I have no chance, so I can only ask you. Leo, your father came from nothing. He survived the border wars and finally carved out a kingdom for himself. You call yourselves the ones who broke the shackles of the aristocracy. But it's been over 30 years. The North Ridge and the Sterling family are inseparable. He has sons. You and Caleb are his legitimate heirs. To avoid disputes, he refused to remarry or take on mistresses. He has made you and Caleb the only choices for the North Ridge cavalry. Isn't this the same iron wall that the great families built in the beginning? You are walking the same path as us. Leo was silent for a moment. You think that way because you don't understand that some people in this world are bound by love. My father doesn't remarry because he made a lifelong promise to my mother. The North Ridge Cavalry is the force he built. He knows this army better than anyone. It's his third son, even more important than my brother and me. The ones who have always seen my brother and me as the only choice for the cavalry are you. By keeping me in Capital City, you haven't trapped the North Ridge. You've only trapped two men, my father and my brother. You still haven't understood something. My father did build an iron wall around the command of the North Ridge Cavalry. But it's not a wall of family lineage. It's a test of whether someone can truly become a commander to bear the weight of being the shield wall for the North Ridge in the endless fight against our enemies. 30 years ago, the man who broke through that wall was my father. 10 years ago, the man who broke through it was Caleb. If, in the future, someone else can break through that wall, unafraid of hardship and suffering, willing to be forged in that fire, then he will be the new commander of the North Ridge Cavalry. You make it sound so noble on your father's behalf, Graves said, his eyes mocking. But the fact is, for years, the Sterling family has monopolized military power in the North Ridge. That's because the two men who have borne that weight happen to be named Sterling. A strange, unyielding light flickered in Leo's eyes. In the dim, flickering light, he was his father, he was his brother, he was the pride that all three men kept hidden beneath their armor. You call my father a wolf. A wolf pack has no concept of bloodline. If you can defeat us, you can lead us. Everything the North Ridge Cavalry is today, it has earned. In the future, Leo's voice trailed off, but Julian understood what he was going to say. He meant that when he returned to the North Ridge, he too would join the fight for leadership. If he could defeat the others, he would be the third alpha wolf. The source of their pride, their unruliness, was that they had never feared a fight. This was his father's spirit. He had taught it to his sons, and he had taught it to the North Ridge Cavalry. Do you know why, Graves asked, the Russo family, who also guard the border and hold military power, have never faced the same hostility from the great families as the Sterlings? He met Leo's gaze, his voice calm. Because you were all born with rebellion in your bones. That pride is the root of Capital City's distrust of the North Ridge. And do you know why the great families never fall? Because we know how to bend with the wind. The president's family is the root of the nation. We surround it, we help it grow, we take turns, we give and take. We are the soil that supports the nation. The ground you stand on, the sky you see, it's all a stability maintained by the great families. Anyone who wants to break this stability is an enemy. 26 years ago, the crown prince tried to break the game. That was naive. He didn't understand that if the great families collapsed, the ruling dynasty would quickly wither. So he had to die. Our chief of staff can die, Mr. Harrison can die, and I can die. But we are only individuals. The great families are not something that can be overthrown by mere human effort. No one can defeat us. For so many years, the only commoner to truly break through and pose a threat in the government is Secretary Hayes. He spent nearly 30 years lying low, and now he's at the top. But does he dare to flip the board? He revives the universities, he promotes commoners. He takes every step with such caution because he knows the result of a brute force struggle is mutual destruction. And how much longer can he live? After he dies, this situation will collapse. He cannot succeed. Graves suddenly laughed. He held the bars, looking at Julian. Professor Quinn led the Crown Prince's faction with an iron fist, refusing to compromise with us. He thought he could succeed, but he got the prince killed. The geniuses of this world should learn some self-reflection. He is a cautionary tale of radicalism. Get him. Julian shot to his feet. Leo moved instantly, but it was too late. Graves began to cough violently, bending over and spitting up blood. He looked up at them, speaking through the pain, blood on his lips. You can't win. You are destined to fail. Leo kicked the cell door open, dragged Graves up, and forced his mouth open. A stream of dark blood trickled out. Graves, like a candle in the wind, convulsed, his limbs stiffening, his eyes wide and unseeing. The candle went out, leaving only the sound of the wind moaning through the prison. The air. Leo dropped the body and strode out. The sky outside was beginning to lighten, but it was still covered in dense, dark clouds. The recent downpour seemed ready to return. A sense of oppression hung in the air, mixed with the sound of hurried footsteps. Leo pushed open a door and saw a group of terrified young women in a cell. The smell of blood was overwhelming. The young men were all dead, their bodies lying in disarray on the floor. Sweat beaded on Leo's temples. He gripped his sidearm, his eyes scanning the terrified faces. He and Julian hadn't done this. Who had killed the heir? A cool wind blew against Leo's soaked back. Before he could turn, he heard the sound of galloping horses. Mr. Fuller, bouncing in his seat, shouted frantically, "Commander! Commander! Get to the White House quickly. The president is in grave danger." Leo spun around, but Julian clamped a hand on his arm. He was unervingly calm. His gaze made Fuller tremble. "What do you mean, grave danger? Explain yourself." Fuller was crying, snot and tears streaming down his face. "The president is critically ill. He's urgently summoning the commander. He has important matters to entrust to you." The sky was heavy, threatening rain. At the White House gate, Leo surrendered his weapon and stepped into a long, dark corridor. Aides knelt on either side, heads bowed in silence. The council room was empty. Fuller hurried Leo to a door and held back the curtain. The curtains in the bedroom were drawn, making the air hot and stagnant, thick with the smell of blood. Fuller whispered through his sobs, "Mr. President, look, the commander is here." From within, President Thompson grunted. He told Fuller to have everyone leave. He needed to speak with the commander alone. They were not to be disturbed until Secretary Hayes arrived. Fuller quietly led the others out. "Leo," Thompson said, his voice weak. He seemed to be shifting in bed. "Pull back the curtains." Leo raised his hand and pulled the heavy drapes aside. The bed was stained with blood. Thompson looked as if he were drowning in it, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. "Buddy." Thompson's pale face was streaked with tears and sweat. He tried to wipe his forehead with a trembling hand but only smeared more blood across his face. "Where have you been? You had me worried sick." His mistress lay beside him, already gone. Leo suddenly felt a pang of loneliness. He had walked into this obvious trap, all to honor that one word, buddy. Their youthful friendship had been crushed by the weight of power, yet in this moment, it seemed to have been pieced back together. He felt as if he were back in the past. He hooked the curtain, his voice hoarse. The wind was strong on the way, and the main avenue was crowded. It was hard to get through. Thompson lifted the hand covering his wound, looking at the stab wound. "You're a good friend. You knew this was dangerous, but you came anyway. I don't regret knowing you, Lee." Leo pulled a chair over and sat down. He looked at Thompson, his throat tightening. He said, "I told you she was no good for you. But I loved her," Thompson said, staring blankly at the blood on his fingers. "I thought she loved me too. Damn, getting stabbed really hurts." Leo rubbed his face, leaning forward. "You called for me. What did you want to say?" Thompson's eyes darted around. Through his tears, he managed to laugh. Then his face crumpled again. He sobbed, "I called you and you came. Are you an idiot, Leo? Don't you know the whole place is crawling with people waiting to kill you?" Leo, calm as ever, like he was solving one of Thompson's old problems, nodded. "I know." Thompson's sobs were muffled. "If you hadn't come, I wouldn't have had to say I'm sorry." Leo's eyes were red. "You're the president. The president doesn't have to apologize." Thompson clutched his wound, shaking his head, crying uncontrollably. "Buddy, I really wanted to be a good president. I even studied up the other day. When you get out, tell Secretary Hayes for me." "You're the president," Leo said. "You tell him yourself." Thompson, gasping for breath, cried, "No, I can't. I'm the president. I can't go myself. I'd lose face. He's a loyal man. Why am I so stupid? I really wanted to call him a father figure. I'm scared. I'm scared that after I'm gone, someone will get you too. How are you going to go anywhere being such a coward?" Leo's voice was rough. Thompson gestured vaguely. "My brother's waiting for me. I'm afraid he'll yell at me again." I let him down. Leo snorted. "Is that all you've got?" Thompson's breathing grew more rapid. His dry lips moved. "I let you down too. I wasn't a good enough friend. You and I, we were both trapped. I really, really hate it. Lee, go. Get out of here and go. Get on your horse and go home. I don't have anything to give you, but not giving you anything feels cheap." Leo rubbed his face again. Thompson raised a finger, pointing at the wall, his words slurring. That rifle. You helped me get it from my brother. But damn it, I can't even draw it. Take it with you. A wolf cub belongs in the grasslands. Your ring must be getting rusty. I don't want it, Leo said coldly. That's your family's rifle. You're the strong one. Thompson's voice was barely a whisper now. He stared at the rifle. Next life. Don't make me come back. I want to be a swallow, living in a rich man's eaves. He gazed quietly at the rifle and then he was still. The wind rustled the curtains in the bedroom. Leo sat, listening to the muffled thunder, the prelude to a downpour. Director Vance finished the last of his coffee, set the cup down, and walked outside. Seeing the Capitol Guard troops arrayed in formation, he smashed the cup on the ground and shouted, "The Presidential Guard in the city is only 8,000 strong. The main force at the training grounds won't get the message in time to reinforce them. Leo Sterling is a caged animal. Today we take him down." The rain came down in a torrent. The pounding of thousands of feet surrounded the White House. The scrape of sheathed weapons against armor filled the air as the Capitol Guard formed a tight cordon around the residence. Fuller, hearing the sounds, collapsed to the floor. The other aides huddled in corners, terrified of being the first sacrifice. Leo finally stood up. In the flickering light, he gently lowered the curtain over Thompson's bed. Then he turned and took the heavy custom rifle from the wall. The doors to the residence were already open. Leo pushed through the layers of swaying curtains and walked out into the rain without a backward glance. Vance and his men drew their weapons. There were no words to shout. They had already won. In this storm, they would change the world and make Leo Sterling kneel once more. Leo looked at the sea of faces before him. He started down the long flight of steps. He had no sidearm. As the rain washed the cold mask from his face, he crashed into the wall of soldiers. The rifle stock blocked a blade. He pushed the line of men back, his unstoppable momentum drowning out the roar of the storm. Julian galloped through the streets, the FSS agents and Presidential Guard behind him, a red serpent in the flashing lights. They smashed through the palace gates, charging inward. The entire complex was a swirling mass of armor and chaos. The arrival of the cavalry accelerated the fight. Julian's white horse, ignoring the press of bodies, charged straight for Leo. In that brief opening, Leo vaulted onto the horse. He caught the blade Julian tossed to him. Leo drew the weapon with a sharp rasp. His voice cut through the storm. "Capital City is not my home. Today I'm going home. Anyone who tries to stop me, kill them." He spurred his horse, and the blade drew blood. Rain lashed his face as he carved a bloody path through the enemy. The battlefield moved from the palace grounds to the city streets. Vance, seeing the tide turn, shouted, "Secure the city gates. Don't let that regicidal traitor escape tonight." The Capitol Guard was no match for the Presidential Guard. Despite their numbers, they were afraid to die, and they were pushed back step by step. The city gate was already sealed. Julian was the first on the wall, kicking aside anyone in his path and ordering his men to open it. The heavy gate groaned as it began to rise. Beyond the curtain of rain was the home Leo had dreamed of for 6 years. Vance turned and shouted, "Bring him out." Leo's horse was already through the gate. He gestured for his lieutenant to lead the men toward the main training grounds. He would take all 20,000 of the Presidential Guard with him. He turned his horse in the crowd and faced the city wall, opening his arms to Julian. His voice was deep and resonant. "Julian, come with me." But the FSS agents stood firm. Julian, in the pouring rain, leaned against the parapet, looking at Leo as if trying to memorize his face. The Capitol Guard was surging forward again, about to pursue them out of the city. The raised gate groaned under the strain, its chains rattling. The gate began to fall. "Leo," Julian called out, his voice gentle despite the storm. "Go home." The words hit Leo like a bucket of ice water. He gripped the reins, already turning his horse back. The gate crashed down with a deafening boom, blocking the pursuing Capitol Guard and sealing Leo outside. Leo shouted until his voice was raw, like a cornered animal. "Julian." Julian no longer looked at him. He turned to face Vance and the dense ranks of the Capitol Guard. Vance spat on the ground. "Julian," he snarled, "you've ruined everything. And you call yourself FSS?" Julian looked down on him, his voice like ice. "Since Director Evans, the FSS has been honorable men with clear consciences. Today, you conspired to assassinate the president. Vance, killing you is justice." Vance threw his head back and laughed. "And what are you? The last of a traitor's line. I treated you well, promoted you multiple times, and this is how you repay me? Come on, bring him up. Let our deputy director have a look." Professor Elliot Quinn was dragged forward. He was disheveled and fell into the muddy rainwater. Cursing, "Deceitful dog." Vance pulled on a chain, spurring his horse forward, dragging Quinn through the street. He pointed at the old man. He spoke to Julian. "Were you looking for him for a long time? He's right here. Julian, aren't you going to come get him? Dog. Traitor." Quinn, enraged, was dragged through the mud. Vance saw the color drain from Julian's face. He saw the darkness in Julian's eyes. He continued, "Your older brother was the heir of a noble house. I remember he was dragged to death by insurgents. But you two weren't close, so you didn't feel a thing. Today, it's your teacher's turn. Do you feel it now? Vance." Julian bit out the name. "You went to all this trouble to keep my teacher hidden. What do you want?" Originally, he had a great purpose. Vance's face twisted. "But you let Leo Sterling go. You ruined my plan. Now you're useless, and so is he. If you still want him to live, get down here and beg for forgiveness. Kneel on the ground and call me Father 3 times, and I'll spare his life and yours." Julian took a step forward. "Done." "Nonsense." Quinn lifted his head from the mud. He wiped the filth from his face and struggled to his feet, staring at Julian. "I taught you literature and philosophy, not so you could be humiliated by others. I, Elliot Quinn, bow to no one, not even the heavens. How can you kneel to this pathetic little man?" The chains rattled. Quinn staggered, shouting into the rain, "100 years are but a dream. I come and go as I please. In this life, I've enjoyed wealth and fame. I've held power and prestige." He laughed like a madman, pulling at the chains around his neck. "I've laughed at all the heroes of this world. None are my equal. Who can compete with me? My name was known throughout the land. When I advised princes and shaped nations, Vance, where were you? Still a rat in the gutter." Quinn stood in the rain as if drunk. "You rats are not even worthy of polishing my shoes. These great families are a disease on the nation. Tell Hayes the country is terminally ill. Neither he nor I can save it." Quinn spun around, laughing wildly, and spat at Vance. "But I will not admit defeat. In this life, I am only a mentor to greatness. Julian, the cage is broken. Chaos is coming. Everything your teacher could teach you, he has already taught. This rotten world." Quinn, his back to Julian, suddenly choked on a sob. The rain soaked him to the bone but could not extinguish the fire of his passion. He had always spoken of his former princely student, but at this moment, he couldn't bear to look back at Julian. This rotten world. Better to burn it all down and build your own. "Julian, go. Don't look back. Your teacher will bear the weight of those 40,000 souls for you. Don't be afraid. You." His blood splattered in the rain. He fell backward, looking at the sky, murmuring, "Don't be afraid." A clap of thunder echoed as Julian fell to his knees. He stared blankly, letting the rain beat down on him. In the long silence, his mask of control shattered. He let out the first cry of true despair he had uttered in 6 years. His red-rimmed eyes were devoid of reason. He grabbed his blade and drew it with a violent shriek. "Vance!" He hated this world, and he hated these faces. Julian pushed himself up, his sword a blur in the rain, flinging bloody water through the crowd. He killed one, then another, stepping over the bodies like a lost animal. The blades sliced through throats like quicksilver, spraying blood across his face. He was a man possessed, the blood on his cheeks like tears. Vance retreated again and again, shouting, "Kill him!" Suddenly, a raindrop shattered in the air. An arrow appeared before Vance in the blink of an eye. Leo leaped from the city wall, sliding down the heavy chain, kicking a man down. He pulled a knife and ran another man through. Using the body as a shield, he charged through the press of blades, his hands soaked in blood as he retrieved his weapon. Leo dragged Julian back with one arm and let out a sharp whistle. A massive bird of prey swooped down, pecking at Vance's right eye in the confusion. Vance cried out, covering his face. He heard the sound of hoofbeats from outside the city. Leo's lieutenant was leading a charge. "Break down the gate," the lieutenant screamed. The presidential guard surged forward. But before they could act, the gate groaned again, slowly being lifted. Agent Fisher, straining against the heavy chains, gasped for breath, pulling with all his might alongside a few loyal FSS agents. He cursed, "So heavy, son of a bitch! Commander, go! Get on your horse and run." Julian's white horse galloped through the gap. The sounds of battle filled Capital City. The same sounds of battle echoed on the border, where a desperate fight was underway. Colonel Grant could barely lift his rifle anymore. As he fell back, he yelled, "Where are the reinforcements?" His deputy, bleeding from several wounds, gasped, "They're not coming." The rain roared. Grant looked back toward his camp. Leo was on his horse, holding Julian in front of him, charging through the storm toward the open gate. Lightning tore the sky apart, and the rain fell in a solid sheet. Grant ripped off his tattered cloak and drove his rifle into the ground beside him. In the wind and rain, he said, "We can't win this fight." His deputy lay on the sand dune, watching him. "Fate wants me to stand guard here my whole life, but this is not the path I chose." Grant unstrapped the armor bearing the insignia of his nation. He wiped the grime from his face. His eyes were full of a weary, self-mocking sorrow. "The desert has buried my comrades. I will no longer bow to a hollow destiny. An order from the capital can't save my men. The government can't feed my horses." Leo had broken out of Capital City, with a legion of pursuers behind him. They charged forward, as if tearing through the dark curtain of rain. "I am no longer willing to die for this." Grant closed his eyes. Blood dripped from his fingers onto the sand. His throat worked. When he opened his eyes again, his expression was grim. The blood on Julian's face was washed away by the rain, but a choked sob of grief escaped his lips. In this desperate flight, he had cast off the obedience of his past. They were a single blade, shattering the storm. Grant washed his hands in the rainwater and picked up his rifle again. They were all prisoners chased by fate. They had once willingly worn the shackles. But the storm had brought down the fortress, and the collapse came like a flood. "Forward, forward! I will cross that mountain. I will fight for myself." The days of rain finally lessened, leaving the roads a mess of mud. Capital City was shrouded in a pale gloom. The sudden death of the young President Thompson, and the rumors that Commander Leo Sterling, in conspiracy with FSS Deputy Director Julian, had assassinated him in an attempted coup, spread like wildfire in whispers behind closed doors. With no heir, the cabinet petitioned the Madam Chairwoman to take control. Citing the tradition of her office not interfering in governance, She refused several times. It was only after Director Vance's third public appeal that she agreed. The Capitol Guard retook control of city patrols. The streets were filled day and night with their patrols. Ordinary citizens dared not leave their homes. The entertainment districts were all closed, their former vibrancy a distant memory. The crimson walls and glazed tiles of Capital City seemed washed out by the ceaseless drizzle. Secretary Hayes had collapsed several times during the official morning. He now lay in bed, unable to take even a sip of medicine. His hair seemed to have turned completely white overnight. His eyes, once sharp and insightful, were now dull and clouded with unshed tears. Sir, Attorney General Pierce sat by his bed, head bowed. You must take your medicine. The country is in chaos. Everyone is waiting for you to restore order. You must take care of yourself. The tear tracks on Hayes's cheeks were still visible. His gaze was distant. After a long moment, he spoke. Restore order? Pierce, I am powerless to turn back the tide. In the courtyard, a bamboo fountain dripped onto a stone, revealing a cracked surface. The rain fell silently, unable to hide the scars. Hayes was too old. His energy had been spent in the political arena. He was on the verge of a final decline. Pierce was suddenly overcome with grief. He sat there, covering his face, and wept. How did it come to this? Director Vance was a viper with a narrow mind. Now that he was in power, the entire government would live in fear. He drove away Leo Sterling. Hayes began to cough violently. The North Ridge is now without its leash. From now on. He coughed up blood, overcome with emotion, clutching the bed frame as he cried, his voice hoarse. From now on, the nation will fracture. An age of chaos is coming. 100 years of rule lost. I am guilty. I am guilty. My whole life, I navigated the treacherous waters of politics, only to set the stage for these villains. Hayes, with his white hair, buried his face and wept. His cries were raw and full of despair. Sir. Pierce rushed to support him, shouting, Someone, help! The curtain was pushed aside, and Victor, Hayes's protege, entered. He immediately knelt by the bed. Ignoring the mess, he wiped Hayes's tears and blood, instructed a servant to bring water and a cloth, and then helped Hayes lie back down. After a few moments of comfort, he whispered to Pierce, Mr. Attorney General, please wait outside. Pierce, not wanting to disturb Hayes further, quickly retreated to the antechamber. After a long time, Hayes's crying subsided. Victor personally fed his mentor the medicine. Once Hayes was asleep, he went out. Pierce started to speak, but Victor gestured for him to follow a servant to the main hall. He himself went to change into clean clothes. My apologies for the wait, Mr. Attorney General. Victor had tea served and sat down. Pierce held the warm cup, silent for a moment. He said, The secretary has no children. I am relieved that you are here to care for him. I shouldn't have brought up these matters today and upset him. The secretary may be at home, but his mind is still on affairs of state, Victor replied. Even if you hadn't mentioned it, he would not have been able to let it go. It's better for him to have cried it out than to keep it bottled up. He stirred his own tea. The situation is unstable now. The secretary won't be able to rest for long. Pierce knew Hayes treated Victor like a son. He didn't hide his concerns. The president's death was so sudden. We are at a disadvantage. The Vance family controls the military in Capital City. The Madam Chairwoman's regency is now a foregone conclusion. What will happen to the North Ridge after this? Victor's hands, holding the porcelain cup, seemed as pale and delicate as the ceramic itself. What's done is done. The important thing now is to plan our next move. Vance's official position is director of the FSS. To overstep his bounds and enter the cabinet, he needs an order from the Madam Chairwoman. So he is not without his vulnerabilities. With Senator Graves' suicide, there is a vacancy in the cabinet that you, Mr. Attorney General, must fill. This way, major state decisions will still require the signature of the Secretary and the rest of you. Pierce put down his cup, asking humbly, but with the Madam Chairwoman as regent, she can change the cabinet at will. What if she uses some pretext to replace us? Victor smiled faintly. Her regency is an emergency measure. She doesn't share the president's family name. Her authority is not absolute. What matters most is the Russo family. General Russo may seem lazy and uninterested in politics, but she carries the weight of her family's reputation for loyalty. She will not allow the Madam Chairwoman and Vance to do as they please in Capital City. Since the Madam Chairwoman wants her support, she won't overplay her hand at this time. Instead of worrying about being replaced, you should be worrying about Vance's next move. Pierce said, Vance is devoted to the Madam Chairwoman. He has already succeeded. On the contrary, Victor looked at the rain mist outside the door. For now, it seems Vance is supporting her. But in the long run, it is she who is relying on him. She came to power because the president had no heir and the government needed a leader. Everyone conceded out of necessity. But the nation will have a new leader eventually. The military power Vance holds is real. The fact that he dared to besiege Leo Sterling and attack the council shows that he fears nothing. You mean, Pierce was shocked? Vance has a secret heir in his possession? Victor sipped his tea. The late emperor often spent nights outside the palace. It's hard to say if there is an heir, but the situation has reached this point. Even if Vance doesn't have an heir, he will find a way to produce one. Pierce's heart sank. Vance has the army and the FSS. The officials in the capital all have families. In a real fight, they might not be willing to oppose him. If he forces a puppet onto the throne, Victor changed the subject. Has the Presidential Guard passed through Danforth City yet? The Presidential Guard had passed through Danforth but had not yet reached the Central Plains. Leo's column was moving fast. Men and horses needed rest. They stopped midway. Julian was gravely ill. The emotional trauma and his old ailments had flared up at once. He drifted in and out of consciousness, trapped in a dreamlike state, drowning again in rain and blood. Leo had suspected since the last epidemic that Julian's body had never fully recovered. The drugs he had taken in his youth were a ticking time bomb. Leo didn't take any chances. The moment they stopped, he sent for a doctor. Julian's head was spinning, a constant ringing in his ears. He could hear Leo's voice, but it was mixed with the sound of his teacher's calls. Lying on the pillow, he woke up several times, thinking he was still in the city of his youth. He could smell food cooking, imagining his teacher's wife standing outside the door. But he didn't dare to move, didn't dare to look. Felt like he had everything, yet he still had nothing. He thought he had killed his own capacity for emotion, that this body could no longer shed tears, but he was wrong. It was only because the pain had not yet reached its depths. He had come this far, only to feel like he was being slowly flayed alive. Leo held Julian. The back of Julian's neck, once so alluring, was now pale. He seemed like a cloud adrift in the night. Leo held him so tightly it hurt. Cold? Leo asked in a low voice. Julian nodded slowly. He turned his head, his cheek pressing against Leo's, the warmth bringing a bit of life back into him. In the darkness, he reached out, his hand weak and slow, searching for Leo's arm. Leo took his hand, their fingers lacing together tightly. He poured all his warmth into Julian, his chest burning hot against Julian's back, as if he could melt him into his own body. He held Julian as if he were prey in his jaws, allowing no one else near. He clumsily licked at Julian's wounds. This was his way of healing. He didn't want this person to hurt anymore. Jones went to find my teacher. Julian's eyes were dark. When will he be back? Soon. Leo squeezed his hand, repeating, soon. Julian said, I can't get the blood off. Leo said, we walk the same dark path. Let's stay together. We don't need to be clean. Julian's lips tightened. He seemed to have forgotten what he was going to say. He stopped, listening to the rain, then closed his mouth again. Leo gently parted his clenched teeth. What were you going to tell me? Julian turned his head away, not wanting Leo to see his face. But Leo held him, not letting him hide, and asked again in a low voice, what were you going to tell me? In Leo's gaze, Julian's face was pale. He opened his mouth several times, but no sound came out. Leo watched him, and finally, after a long moment, he heard Julian say in a choked voice, it hurts. Leo cupped Julian's face. Julian seemed to have reverted to a child. His lips trembled as he repeated, it hurts, over and over, tears streaming down his face. Leo stroked his hair, using his thumb to wipe away the tears. Where does it hurt? Tell me everything. Julian sobbed uncontrollably, his shoulders shaking. He cried as if his heart were breaking, as if all the pain of the past years was being released in this one night. But he was so lost. He didn't know where it hurt. He just knew he couldn't bear it anymore. He let Leo wipe his face, his eyes overflowing with tears. The mature, calculating mind was gone, leaving only raw, naked pain. Leo rolled over and pulled Julian into a full embrace, giving him a place to finally let go of his mask. They held each other tightly. Leo listened to Julian cry until his voice was hoarse, like an abandoned animal, like a child who had run headfirst into a wall. Leo's chest was soaked. He stroked Julian's hair and answered again and again, it won't hurt anymore. Promise. It won't hurt anymore. The rain stopped at dawn. The world was a murky gray in the shifting light. General Russo, boots caked in mud, came off the training field. As she tied on her arm guards, she saw her deputy ride into camp. Her deputy was a strong, sturdy man, but surprisingly meticulous. He could wield an axe on the battlefield and a needle in the barracks, and he was well respected by the troops. He dismounted midway, gave a quick nod to the saluting soldiers, and walked straight to Russo. General, we have news. Capital City or the border? Russo asked. Both, he said, his voice low. He glanced around. Capital City got a thorough washing. Young Sterling escaped in the chaos. He's taken the 20,000 Presidential Guard and is on the border of the Central Plains. Looks like he's heading for Irving County. Russo didn't seem surprised at all. She tightened her arm guard, biting the strap and letting out a muffled laugh. The kid's fast. Her deputy continued with the ration scandal first, and then the siege of Sterling. The old general of the North Ridge is definitely going to be furious this time. If the North Ridge rebels will have to send garrisons to the Central Plains. Command of the Central Plains forces would also fall under my authority, Russo said, pulling on her jacket. The Central Plains is a huge territory. Even if they gave it to me, I wouldn't dare take it. Capital City can wait. First, tell me what's going on with the Border Command. Did Colonel Grant chase the insurgents all the way back to their homeland? The deputy's rugged face showed hesitation. General, Colonel Grant disregarded orders this time. He pursued the insurgents across the border. I suspect. He trailed off, not saying the word. Russo said, their rations were cut in half this year. The border is having a tough time. I used my father's name to sign for a loan in the river provinces. That money was meant to buy food for the border command. What do you suspect? I don't listen to anything without proof. The deputy knew Russo valued her commanders and was always fair. She would never condemn a man based on hearsay. But his trip to the border had raised his suspicions for a reason. He didn't dare hide it. General, I wouldn't say anything without proof. I went to the border to investigate the recent military situation. But not only was Colonel Grant not in his camp, he had even moved the troops from the signal towers. Russo stopped short. He moved the signal tower garrisons? The deputy nodded. He was about to elaborate when they heard a commotion. They both turned to see a group of people at the camp entrance, surrounding a fancy sedan, being held back by the guards. Mr. Finch, the bureaucrat, annoyed by the unyielding guards, personally drew back the curtain. Don't you know who I am? He shrieked. Why are you stopping my car? I am the president's appointed overseer from Capital City. Go and inform General Russo that I have urgent matters to discuss. Russo watched from a distance. She told her deputy, go and deal with him. Tell him I'm busy. These functionaries from the capital are all the same. Give him food and drink, keep him happy, and tell him to keep his mouth shut and not cause trouble. I'm going to the border now. Grant is not the type to desert his post. Before I get back, tell anyone from the capital that I'm not here. The water is muddy there. You keep an eye on my father too. If he tries to communicate with Capital City, you intercept it. Tell him to behave himself. The deputy started to say something, but Russo had already mounted her horse. Before leaving, she looked back. It will take at least 2 weeks for things to settle in Capital City. The alliance next month will have to be postponed. Take down all the celebratory decorations at home. That's all money. With that, she was gone, leading her men around Finch's car and heading straight for the border. Julian had taken medicine, and his condition slowly improved on the road. The Presidential Guard had to continue northeast. They had to find a way to convince the governor of Irving County, a man named Joe, to let them pass. Before that, they had to shake off the pursuers who were clinging to them like ghosts. The one right behind us is Caden Vance, a burly officer said, hunched over his rifle. If we can't beat him before we reach Irving, he'll show up with an order from Capital City and force Joe to lock the city down, trapping us in the Central Plains. Leo stood with his arms crossed, saying nothing. A crude map was spread out before them. He wasn't afraid of a fight with Caden, but he had to consider the time. The longer it took, the worse it was for his troops. General Russo hadn't moved against him yet, but only because Capital City was in chaos without an heir. Once the situation there stabilized and they could order Russo to hunt them down, his 2,000 men would be running into a brick wall. The problem wasn't the fight. It was the speed. Julian's pale face had yet to regain its color. He picked up a stone and drew lines on the ground. Caden dares to pursue us this far because Danforth City is right behind him. The granaries there are wide open to his capital guard. They don't have to worry about supplies. We've run this far on sheer will. We have no supply line. To get to the North Ridge through Irving, we have to solve this problem first. The burly officer wasn't used to strategizing with Julian. He was silent for a moment, then looked at Leo. Leo, not looking at him, said, "Speak your mind." The officer shifted his position. He pointed at the ground. "We have a history with Irving. Can't we just get Joe to claim an intelligence blackout and lend us some emergency rations?" No, Julian dropped the stone. At this critical juncture, any action is a declaration of allegiance. Even if Zhou doesn't mean it that way, if he helps us, in capital city's eyes, he's aiding rebels. After we pass through Irving, he'll be arrested and sent to the capital for trial. Zhou has a family. He would never do it. A young soldier, Ding Tal, looked up from his notebook. Didn't Corvo go to arrange for supplies? He must be on his way to us. The supplies he arranged for have already been sent to the North Ridge, Leo said. That's for the front lines. There's no surplus for us. He squatted down, studying the map. Even if he and Gus got here, they couldn't bring much. An army marches on its stomach. The reason the North Ridge and the Eastern Command could beat back the insurgents so quickly was because the insurgents had no logistical support. They couldn't sustain a long campaign. Right now, we're in the same boat, caught here, unable to last long. Attacking Irving was an option, but a bad one. They had invested heavily in the county, building a relationship of mutual support with Zhou for the future. We could turn back and take Danforth, the officer suggested. Danforth has granaries. We don't stay long, just grab the food and go. Then when we get to Irving, it will be easier to talk to Zhou. No, Julian sighed softly. Danforth has direct military roads to the major cities and to Capital City. Turning back would give them time to deploy the rest of the Capitol Guard. We'd waste time on the road, and taking the city wouldn't be quick. The officer's two suggestions had been shot down by Julian. He felt a bit embarrassed and rubbed his hands together, saying nothing more. His brother was a great hero, a commander, but he had never been taught strategy. He felt awkward but was also impressed. He wasn't an unreasonable man. He could admit he was out of his depth. Leo seemed to read his mind. He clapped him on the back. Attacking Danforth is a time-sensitive option, but it's an option. You've only ever fought street battles with the Capitol Guard back in the city. Now you're out in the open. If you don't know something, ask. In the future, you'll be leading men and making decisions. You won't always have Julian to advise you. You've got to be willing to learn from your mistakes. That's how you grow. The lines on the ground were a mess. Julian looked at the sun. Caden is a capital city blue blood. The only riding he's done is on a hunting preserve. That's why he can't keep up with us. An ambush here could cut off his supply line, Leo said, looking around. We wouldn't even need 2,000 men. He's afraid of you, Julian said. His fingertips smudged with dirt. He's been chasing us cautiously. To get him into a trap, we need bait. I'll take 500 men and wait for him here. To the east, there's a muddy river, flanked by hills and a forest. You, he said to the officer, take 2,000 men and set an ambush there. Leo wiped the dirt from Julian's finger. He then addressed the young soldier. Tonight, you take some men to the local towns. Spread the word that the Presidential Guard is stranded here because I'm too broke to buy food and can't get out of the Central Plains, so morale is collapsing and desertions are rampant. Caden was young and had crossed paths with Leo before. Julian was right, he was afraid of Leo. In fact, most of the young aristocrats in Capital City were. Leo's physique and personality had made him the de facto king of their circle long before his famous feats. The hunting competition had been a turning point. Caden, not being the eldest son, had been coddled his whole life, his path to a career smoothed by his father and older brother. He seemed similar to Leo on the surface but had never stood out on his own. He might be cautious in his pursuit out of fear of Leo, but he would never pass up a chance to defeat him. As long as Leo gave him an opening. In addition to that, Julian thought for a moment, then told the young soldier, you also need to say that the commander and I are at odds, that we've been arguing constantly. That we're on the verge of splitting up. Trapped from within and without, Leo grinned, showing his teeth. Make it sound as pathetic as possible. The young soldier scribbled furiously in his notebook. The burly officer, still unconvinced, asked, "Can he pull it off? Let him do a rehearsal for us." The young soldier rubbed his eyes. He held up his notebook and began to recite. "My boss has been screwed over so bad. The Capitol Guard is chasing us like dogs. So hard he doesn't even have money for soup. We fled Capital City in a hurry. Didn't have time to pack up our properties or businesses. Didn't even get the money from the house. Our pockets are empty. My boss still owes thousands for some jewelry he bought on the main avenue, and now he can't pay it back. Mister, Julian got sick from the rain, really sick, but there's no money for a doctor, and now he's abandoned my boss too. The troops are starving on the run. I'm so hungry, my mouth is watering. I couldn't take it anymore, so me and a few buddies started robbing people on the road to get some cash. We used to be good kids, but we were forced into this all because we followed the wrong guy. Now we're just getting some food and moving on, heading to Danforth to surrender to Caden Vance. He's great, he's got money and food. Following him is the only future." His delivery was full of emotion. Leo said, "Your boss thinks you did a great job. Officer, take his coat, smear some mud on his face, give him a few coins and send him on his way. No need for a fancy meal. Just have him beg in the town square. And stop staring at Julian." Caden Vance began to capture deserters from the Presidential Guard. They were all filthy and emaciated. After several interrogations, he learned of their plight, but he still didn't dare to advance recklessly. 20,000 men was no small number, and he constantly weighed his chances in a direct confrontation with Leo Sterling. The Presidential Guard had performed impressively during the hunt competition. They had fought hard for control of the city gate patrols and killed many of his men. Caden sat in his tent, looking at the captured deserter. "You followed Sterling in his rebellion. Why are you scattering now?" "Sir, we can't go on." The deserter knelt before him. "We've run this far, middle of nowhere. No food, no camp. Ahead is Irving, to the south is the Eastern Command. We're walking into a trap." Caden thought for a moment. "Are many deserting?" "There were only a few hundred when I left," the soldier said. "The guard is like reeds in a swamp right now. One push and we'll break." Caden found it strange. "Hasn't Sterling tried to do anything? I heard he's a strict disciplinarian. His men are afraid of him." "Sir, you don't understand," the soldier said after a moment, swallowing hard. "Can I have some rations first? I've been running for days, I'm too hungry to think straight." Caden signaled for a man to give him some hardtack. The soldier began to devour it. Between mouthfuls, he said, "That's the point. We're afraid of him. Back in the capital, we had nowhere else to go. We had to follow him, and we ended up on the wrong side of you guys in the Capitol Guard. Now he's a traitor. Why would we stick with him?" Caden saw how genuinely desperate the deserters looked. They had been captured, not turned themselves in, so it didn't seem like a trick. He began to plan. He had the deserters taken away and started to discuss strategy with his advisors. Among them was a man named Gao, the leader of a student protest years ago. He had offended a powerful figure, been thrown in jail, and with no one to bail him out, his political career was over. He had joined Caden's staff. He was a passionate idealist who hated traitors. The news of Leo's alleged assassination and rebellion had filled him with righteous fury. Gao pointed at the map. "Since Sterling is at the end of his rope, we can't allow him to roam free in the Central Plains. You have a strong force and the support of Danforth. I say we move immediately. Capturing him before he reaches Irving will be a great victory." Caden was still hesitant. "But Sterling still has thousands of men, all veterans of the hunt. It's a trick, Gao said, unconvinced. The guards' morale has collapsed. 10,000 men or one, it makes no difference. They're a rabble now, not a threat. You've pursued him this far. If you don't capture him soon, you won't be able to answer to Capital City. Caden was tempted. What if he's colluding with Governor Zhou in Irving to trap me? Gao said, almost impatiently, Sir, Governor Zhou has a family. Is he going to throw away a good career to join a traitor in rebellion? He wouldn't dare. If we attack now, we'll catch Sterling completely by surprise. Then we can press our advantage and return victorious. Caden had been sleeping in a tent for days, covered in insect bites. He was anxious to get back to Capital City. His brother Vance was propping up the Madam Chairwoman's regency. The Vance family star was rising. It was a time for celebration, and every day he spent out here was another day of frustration. Gao's words convinced him. He agreed. The next day, Caden rose early and led his troops forward through the morning dew. Following the deserters' information, he tracked them to the woods outside the muddy river. The cooking pits in the forest were too small to feed 2,000 men. Caden was now completely convinced. He sat high on his horse, full of confidence, and waved his sword forward. The traitor is cornered. Search this forest, and you will find him. The Capitol Guard swarmed in. Leo was crouching by a stream, washing his face. He heard the noise and looked up to see Caden charging toward him on horseback. Caden saw him and shouted, "The traitor is here. Capture him." Leo whistled for his horse. His 500 men, scattered in apparent panic, chased through the woods. Caden, seeing this, was overcome with excitement. He laughed, then shouted, "Commander, you've seen better days." Leo abandoned his men and fled on his horse. Caden, afraid he would escape, led a direct pursuit. The Capitol Guard crashed through the woods, following Caden toward the northeast. Caden grew more frantic, shouting, "Leo Sterling, you're surrounded. Surrender now." Leo looked back, leading his men in a futile attempt to fight back against the overwhelming numbers. His 500 men were routed, fleeing the forest toward the muddy river, where they were finally cornered. "Leo Sterling," Caden reined in his horse. "Look around you. You're surrounded by my Capitol Guard. You're trapped. What's the point of struggling? Beg for mercy now, and I'll spare your life." Leo's horse pawed at the ground. He said coldly, "You want me dead? Fine. I only ask, why didn't Vance come himself? My brother is now a regent, burdened with affairs of state. Why would he come here to deal with you?" Caden pointed his sword at Leo. "Dismount and surrender. Your Sterling family might still have a chance. You alone have committed this monstrous crime. Are you going to let your whole family pay the price? I have indeed made many mistakes." Leo looked up, his eyes narrowed at Caden. "But it's not for the Vance family to lecture me." As he spoke, hundreds of men rose up on both sides. The burly officer led the charge, completely encircling Caden's forces from behind, his men cutting down everyone in their path. Caden's personal guard were all FSS agents, sent by Vance to protect him. They knew they had been tricked. They whipped Caden's horse, trying to break through the side and escape into the forest. Caden had never seen a real battle before. He was a skilled fighter in the training grounds, but this was different. He was terrified. His horse, stung by the whip, bolted, and with his FSS guard, he managed to reach the edge of the forest encirclement. Julian stood there, his hand on his weapon, watching from the shadows. Caden tried to push forward, but his guards quickly reined him in. They exchanged panicked glances amidst the sweat and blood. Finally, their leader spoke. "Deputy Director, Meeting you here today must be fate. For old time's sake, how about you let us go? Julian had grown thinner these past few days. The bones of his wrist, holding his blade, were like a crescent moon against his white sleeve. His eyes were like ice, but a warm, spring-like smile spread across his face. He said, "My brothers, you are all just following orders. I understand." The man knew Julian's cruel nature. Seeing him smile, he pulled Caden back a few more steps. Behind them, the sounds of battle raged, and Leo was closing in. Sweat poured down the man's face. "Deputy Director, you have a limitless future. Why suffer here with a traitor? If you let Director Caden return to the capital, his brother will surely forgive and forget, and welcome you back." Julian actually chuckled. His voice was soft, and his smile was beautiful. His pale skin seemed delicate in the dappled sunlight. He slowly drew his blade. The long, thin blade scraped against the scabbard. "I am very grateful to Director Vance," Julian said, his hand closing around the hilt. He paused. "My gratitude is beyond words. When you go back, please take a gift to him from me." A chill ran down Caden's back, and he nearly fell off his horse. Leo was rinsing the blood from 2 blades in the stream. Julian crouched behind him, washing his hands. He submerged his entire hand in the water and left it there even after Leo had finished. Leo squatted opposite him, their heads close despite the height difference. Their hands met in the water, and Leo took his fingers. Julian's crying had been a nightmare in the darkness. In the sunlight, he was clean and composed. His finger traced Leo's hand, slipping between his fingers to press against his palm, cool and smooth with the flowing water. The burly officer was overseeing the cleanup of the battlefield. They would have to stay in the forest for another night. Soldiers were all around them, but Julian's touch was both casual and deliberate, a calculated seduction. He still smelled of blood. Leo let him, saying, sending back only one survivor, he might not deliver the message. Julian looked at the sparkling surface of the stream. He's FSS. As long as his head is still attached, he has to complete his mission. Caden is in our hands. If he can't get the message back, his mission is a failure. He's dead either way, might as well die with some honor. Besides, that sack of heads all belong to FSS agents with ID. He has to bring his brothers home. Leo wanted to wipe a drop of blood from Julian's wrist, but they were surrounded. They looked at each other for a moment. Then he squeezed Julian's hand, leaned in slowly, and said, "Your earring was left behind in Capital City. We'll get you a new one when we reach the North Ridge."